Do I think that there are too high expectations for UFC 300? I look at the matchups beside the Harrison versus Holm fight as all interesting. Yeah, here's the thing with UFC 300. I see a lot of people crapping on the card, but think about this. First of all, what is it that you all were expecting? Not literally you all, but like what is it that fight fans were expecting from UFC 300? Were they expecting 7 title fights on the card? The UFC is not going to do that because that that means that all the pay-per-views around UFC 300 are going to be terrible pay-per-views. They're not going to have enough stars to fill out other pay-per-views. If you look at the UFC 100 card, if you look at the UFC 200 card, and think about and kind of put UFC 300 next to those cards. Granted, we still don't have a main event, possibly even a co-main event. We still could get Leon versus Bilal, which I know fan reaction to that is a little bit mixed, and we also still don't have a main event for the card. So people are saying UFC 100 is terrible without even seeing the full card yet. Don't reserve your judgment until the absolute full card is coming out. It looks like that is going to be tickets go on sale for UFC 300. It's still a little bit of time. I saw today that it had been pushed back to February 21st is when tickets go on sale for UFC 300. So that's still a little bit of time. It still might be. I thought for sure we'd get the main event this week, but maybe it'll be next week. Not really sure on that. But go back and look at UFC 100 and UFC 200 and compare our UFC 300 card with that and ask yourself, is this really a bad card? I look at UFC 100 and 300 and 200. Granted, there is cards age in different ways. Let me actually just show you these two cards real quick. This is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think I'll make my point here. UFC 100, the first of the triple digit UFC cards, had a lot of good fights on it. But like, look at the prelims for UFC 100. You had Stun Gun on there against TJ Grant, Tom Lawler against CB Dalloway. You had Shannon Gugerty opening the card against Matt Grice. Overall, and then you had Jim Miller against Mac Danzig. John Jones, who was not a big, he was a prelim fighter at this point, fighting Jake O'Brien. You had Mark Coleman against Stephan Bonner, Sexyama against Alan Belcher. And then you only had 2 title fights on the card, GSP versus Thiago Alves, Brock Lesnar versus Frank Mir. You had the epic Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping KO. But like that was the first one. So is UFC 300 a better or worse card so far than that? I feel like it's better. I feel like there are prelims. UFC 100 had prelims that felt a little bit prelim-y. And now if we go to UFC 200, which I realize is a little bit unfair because they had the main event fall out. But let's just try to imagine UFC 200 with the main event, original main event of John Jones versus Daniel Cormier in a rematch, which would have been the perfect main event. You also had 2 other title fights. You had Amanda Nunes against Miesha Tate, which ended up being the main event. But at that point, again, Amanda Nunes was not a big star. This is when she took the belt. Miesha Tate was a pretty big name, but this was not like a massive fight. Brock Lesnar versus Mark Hunt, that was kind of the rabbit in the hat for that event, but that was not ultimately a great fight, a fairly dull fight. You had DC fighting Anderson Silva kind of at the last minute, also not a great fight. Aldo against Edgar, a rematch for the interim featherweight championship. That was a good fight. And then the prelims, they stacked pretty good. Even still today, a lot of these fighters are still pretty big names in and of their own right. But I mean, you had like Jim Miller versus Takanori Gomi opening up the card. Joe Lozon versus Diego Sanchez. That was a very short fight. Then you had Sage Northcutt versus Enrique Marin. So some good fights, but like thinking about UFC 300, so far what we have matches up to that. And I would even say potentially even exceeds that. And we still don't have a main or co-main event. So I'm just wondering, like, what are fans expecting here? If I'm guessing the main event is either going to be DDP versus Israel Adesanya. We still think we could get Michael Chandler versus Conor McGregor, even though Dana White did say that the fight they're looking at for the fall, I kind of feel like there's some negotiation tactics going on here. Some folks have pointed out that Conor McGregor may be trying to get a new contract. UFC is also kind of factoring all this into their media rights deal. So I think there are some bigger things going on. We haven't really gotten any answers why Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler isn't happening, hasn't already happened already. But I feel like expectations are way too high. I'm just like, what actually did people think UFC was going to be? And if you that's what you get, whatever, 6, 7, tons and tons of title fights, all these like people coming back out of retirement. I mean, do you really want to see a 45-year-old George St. Pierre? Do you really want to see? I mean, Khabib, okay, I would tune in for that, but he's been out of shape for a long time. Do you really want to see a 45-year-old Brock Lesnar? Do you really want to see Ronda Rousey coming out of retirement for the last like 7 years? I mean, that would be interesting. Sure, but I personally would rather have the card stacked with like current big names in the UFC rather than a lot of people who haven't been training for a couple years, who are way out of their prime. It seemed like people thought that we were going to get a lot of those. Like, sure, let's get GSP versus Khabib, but like, guys, Khabib has said so many times that he is not coming back. Like, sometimes you just got to let things go. And I think that if we get DDP versus Adesanya, imagine if we got both DDP versus Adesanya and McGregor versus Chandler, in addition to what we already have, I think that absolutely that would be the best UFC card that we've already gotten. If you just look at this thing as it is right now, I mean, it's an incredible card. And if there's like even a main event that's like pretty good, it feels like a 10. I mean, just put it up next to like what have been some of the biggest UFC cards that we've got in history. We've got UFC, the first New York show, Conor McGregor against Eddie Alvarez. I feel like UFC 300 in terms of star power and quality goes up against that. And then the only other ones that come to mind in terms of like epically big UFC cards are UFC 100 and 200, which we just looked at. And I feel like 300 so far stacks up really well against that. The smallest fights on the card are like Sodiq Yusuff versus Diego Lopez, which are two ranked guys, or at least Yusuff is, and Lopez is one of the most entertaining guys on the roster. The other like lowest fight that we have is Jim Miller versus Bobby Green, which is just like so to have that on UFC 300. Both guys super entertaining. Jim Miller just like making this incredible appearance on UFC 100 and 200. So I know it sounds like I'm shilling for the UFC, but I just feel like realistically, guys, I mean, we're already getting tons of Apex events. I feel like kind of in response to UFC 299, UFC 300 being so stacked. The ripple effect is that we're getting a lot of Apex shows. So do you really want an epically huge UFC 300 and then a string of really weak pay-per-views? I don't. I think UFC 300 is trying the way it is. Imagine if UFC 300 had any other number to it. If it was 301, 302, 303, just an international fight week card, like it would be spectacular. People would say it's the best card ever, but just because it's 300, people feel like it has to have another added quality to it. We've set ourselves up to have a good main event UFC 301 if we've got Alex Pereira defending the light heavyweight belt, and then also, man, I would love to see Alexandre Pantoja defending his belt against Kyoji Horiguchi, co-main of UFC 301. We just saw Dana White meeting with Nobuyuki Sakakibara at the UFC headquarters earlier this week. Horiguchi has stated he wants to go back to the UFC. Man, how cool would that be if they could send Horiguchi over and potentially have this Japanese UFC champion? Oh, I would love that. UFC 301 could be excellent. And I feel like, yeah, no complaints from me with UFC 300. What were y'all expecting?